Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Course 10 of the Monique and Roland Weil People's Academy of International Law. I am Marjorie Cohn, Dean of the People's Academy and a member of the Bureau of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. Our topic for today's course is International Law Protects Struggles for Liberation and Emancipation. Our distinguished faculty for this course is Raji Sarani, Bill Bowring, Max Bokwana, and Miriam Boisdi. Each of them will speak for 30 to 35 minutes. They will then comment on each other's presentations, followed by questions and answers with all of you. We have French, Spanish, and English translation. You can select your language at the bottom of your screen. Please put your questions in the Q&A box for our discussion. In the next few days, we will post on our website, peoplesacademy.net, the faculty presentations in English, French, and Spanish, along with written presentations and outlines and links to relevant articles. You will receive an email when the program is posted. This course will examine the right to self-determination of people and, in particular, Palestine, South Africa, and Algeria. In the current case of Palestine, the right of self-determination includes the right of Palestinians to resist Israel's unlawful occupation and the right to select their own political leaders, elect their own governing bodies, and more. Our faculty will explain the international instruments and jurisprudence which purport or are intended to protect the collective right to self-determination. The United Nations Charter and two covenants, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the ICCPR, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, guarantee the right of peoples to self-determination. The ICCPR also guarantees freedom of expression, association, assembly, and participation in government. These and other international human rights law provisions are intended to protect peoples struggling against foreign occupation, aggression, colonialism, and apartheid. In 1983, the UN General Assembly reaffirmed the legitimacy of the struggle of peoples for their independence, territorial integrity, national unity, and liberation from colonial domination, apartheid, and foreign occupation by all available means, including armed struggle. For more than 2 years, Israel has conducted a campaign of genocide in Gaza, killing more than 69,000 and wounding over 170,000 Palestinians. Nearly everyone in Gaza has been displaced multiple times, and Gaza has largely been reduced to rubble. In 3 recent cases, the International Court of Justice found a plausible case of genocide by Israel, that Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory is unlawful, and that Israel has illegally used starvation of civilians as a weapon of war. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant for war crimes and crimes against humanity. There has been systematic repression by states in North America, Europe, and elsewhere against people's movements protesting the genocide and the violation of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. Students, faculty, and immigrants have been targeted in violation of their rights to freedom of expression, association, and assembly. Universities and media outlets have been blackmailed into capitulating to Zionist pressure. And the UN Security Council has just voted to give the United States a mandate over Palestine. UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Francesca Albanese, issued a statement today saying that the new Security Council resolution violates the Palestinian right to self-determination and the UN Charter. She said it will leave Palestinians in the hands of a puppet administration, assigning the United States, which shares complicity in the genocide, as the new manager of the open-air prison that Israel has already established. Replacing an abusive trustee with another is not self-determination. It is unlawful. I will now introduce our faculty. First, we have Raji Sourani. He has received widespread recognition as the Gaza Strip's foremost human rights lawyer. He has been imprisoned on 6 occasions, the longest for a period of 3 years, and he was named a prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International in 1988. Raji was awarded the Joint Laureate for Robert F. Kennedy Memorial for Human Rights in 1991, and he has received several other human rights awards throughout his career. In 2024, Raji became a member of South Africa's legal team in the genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. Raji will provide an update on the so-called ceasefire. Is it real? Has the genocide stopped? He will also discuss Trump's so-called peace plan. Will it end the occupation? Will it guarantee the Palestinians' right to self-determination? Next, we have Professor Bill Bowering. Bill has taught human rights and international law at Birkbeck College, University of London, since 2006. He entered academia in 1990. A practicing barrister since 1974, Bill has represented applicants at the European Court of Human Rights since 1992, especially against Turkey and Russia. He has acted as a consultant and expert for the United Nations, the Council of Europe, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, the European Union, and the UK government. Bill has more than 150 publications, including monographs, edited collections, chapters, and articles. His first monograph, The Degradation of the International Legal Order, the Rehabilitation of Law, and the Possibility of Politics, which was published in 2008 by Routledge, has been translated into Russian and published by NLO Publishers in 2021. Bill's second monograph is Law, Rights, and Ideology in Russia, Landmarks in the Destiny of a Great Power, also published by Routledge in 2013. In 2017, Bill was awarded a fellowship of the Academy of Social Sciences, FACSS, for his work on Russia. Bill will provide an explanation of the legal right to self-determination and the right to resist oppression. Our next faculty member is Max Bokwana, who has more than 27 years' experience as an attorney in private practice, and he has held several important positions in South Africa, the African continent, and internationally. Max has served as president of the Law Society of South Africa, the National Association of Democratic Lawyers, and the SADC Lawyers Association, an association of the 14 countries of the Southern African region. Max is a member of the Bureau of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers and he has represented several victims in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings. He was appointed by the Minister of Justice on various occasions as an acting judge of the High Court, and he represented the Interministerial Committee on the Arms Procurement, led by former President Thabo Mbeki, and Ministers of Defense, Finance, Trade, and Industry. He was also appointed by the Minister of Justice to lead the process of drafting the Legal Practice Act. Max served as a commissioner on the International Commission of Inquiry on Systemic Racist Police Violence against People of African Descent in the United States. He now serves as the Chief Executive Officer of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, a major African think tank devoted to the practical implementation of laws, of ideas that advance the interests of the African continent. Max will discuss the role of international law in the struggle against apartheid and for the right to self-determination in South Africa. Our fourth faculty member is Miriam Boazdi. Miriam is a practitioner scholar of international humanitarian law, human rights law, and transitional justice, with nearly 20 years of experience investigating violations in conflict and post-conflict contexts across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. She has served for more than a decade within United Nations investigative and accountability mechanisms, including the IIIM for Syria, the UN Commission of Inquiry on Syria, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, where she specialized in drafting, legal drafting, evidentiary assessment, multi-source corroboration, and the legal characterization of mass atrocity crimes. Miriam's work engages directly with core questions at the heart of international law and decolonial studies: the legal architecture governing armed conflict, accountability for structural and systematic violence, and the evolving jurisprudence on these issues, sanctions regimes, and resistance to oppression. She has led field missions in complex political landscapes, analyzed the conduct of state and non-state armed actors, and contributed to high-level submissions before UN bodies and national jurisdictions, as well as international criminal law judgments and pleadings. Miriam's recent research and consultancy work intersects with debates on international criminal accountability, frozen assets, and sanctions, as well as the limits and possibilities of transitional justice in contexts marked by colonial legacies and the ongoing struggles for liberation. Miriam will address the legal and political aspects of the struggle of the Algerian Revolution against French colonialism in the late 1950s and early 60s. So our first presentation will be by Raji Surani. Raji, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marjorie. And it's quite an honor to be with you and with the Academy again. I'm humbled, to address through you a quite important and very, very sensitive topic, and it's very timely. Friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm going to address first the ceasefire. All of us, lived the last 2 years, and the atrocities, the massive killing, massive destruction, massive displacement, and famine, which is going in Gaza and the occupied territories at large. And all of us, lived this horrific genocide. And the ethnic cleansing, which was taking place extensively in the last 2 years, was obvious and clear. That's without going to too much details. First mission, first thing was wanted in this genocidal war was having a ceasefire, end for massive killing and massive destruction. After the harvest was horrendous, unprecedented. And when we were talking about ceasefire, we were talking about stopping, this massive killing, destruction, this famine, this displacement happening, to the people, the dosage of pain and suffering. Never ever Palestinian people passed in their history anything as such. Having in mind this is the first ever genocide broadcasted live on the air and at the real time. But none of us wanted to have ceasefire on the expense of the institutionalizing the occupation, on the expense of deleting the right of self-defense and self-determination. None of us wanted to have that on the expense of the unalienable rights of the Palestinian people, or on the expense of international law, international humanitarian law, and the human rights. Actually, the ceasefire happened, but the ceasefire didn't mean stop killing or destruction, didn't mean stopping the genocide or the ethnic cleansing. The level of killing has been reduced, and so far almost 350 since the ceasefire has been killed, including many women and children. And still the genocide going on, and still the ethnic cleansing going on. So the real target of the ceasefire hasn't been achieved, especially we are talking about very, very fragile ceasefire can be collapsing any minute. So still at this moment and in Gaza, the level of killing less, but the killing is still going on. The genocide just continuing, and all conditions there in Gaza there for this crime to continue. And having even the ethnic cleansing there with the existing conditions, this will make the ceasefire meaningless for the people. Yes, true, some of the food was able to come in, but it didn't end the famine. It's true, some of the medicine came in, but it didn't help in bringing a change to the health situation in the Gaza Strip. Still, we are having in Gaza no schools, no universities, all of them erased. Still, we have no hospitals, no clinics, because all of them erased. We still have no healthy water to drink. We don't have enough food for children and babies and ordinary people, and still the famine all over the place. We don't have sewage. We don't have electricity. We don't have streets. We don't have buildings. 90% of Gaza destroyed and erased. And if this or these conditions continue, with the winter is coming and it's already there, Gaza inhabitable place. And this will force people to leave, the Gaza Strip in these unhuman conditions. People having and enjoying. So that's why don't buy the ceasefire as end of the war, as end of the genocide or the ethnic cleansing. No, we are still far from the lot. We are having very fragile ceasefire, and I want to say and make emphasis more. It has nothing to do with peace at all. So I hope we be aware that the existing situation in the Gaza Strip and the occupied territories very fragile, and that doesn't mean guarantee, but what US trying to promote, what Israel trying to promote, that there is a ceasefire and business as usual. We have normal situation. We are very, very far from having a normal situation. Having said that, this leads us to the second point, related to Trump plan, which was voted at the Security Council. Security Council usually, its resolutions based on two things: respecting the UN resolutions and respecting international law, international humanitarian law, and the human rights. Actually, Trump plan didn't address at all any of the basic elements which can bring justice and dignity and peace for Palestinian people. First, there is no single word about ending the Israeli occupation to the occupied Palestinian territories, as if the occupation is not the reason for all what we are having of war crimes, crimes against humanity, persecution, genocide, and apartheid and ethnic cleansing in Palestine for the last 80 years. So no mentioning of ending the occupation. If we don't have end of the criminal, belligerent Israeli occupation, or the reasons, for opening the conflict again, it will be there and it will continue to be there. Second, no word about Palestinian right of self-determination no word about the unalienable rights of the Palestinian people, no word about the Palestinian people and their right of having the independence and Palestinian state on the occupied territories of 5th of June 1967, as UN resolutions has stated in a clear-cut way. There is no word, not a single word, about accountability, as in the last 2 years, nothing had happened by the Israeli belligerent occupation. And it passes unnoticed. Tomorrow, there will be the 80th anniversary of Nuremberg trials, of the accountability of the Nazis. And instead of making the rule of law basic, fundamental rule for justice and dignity of man, no, we just pass it and we victimize rule of law and the bringing rule of jungle. Life of Palestinians matters. They deserve justice and dignity and accountability for all the crimes has been committed against them by this Israeli criminal occupation. No word about international law, international material law. If we don't have the rule of law, the alternative, the rule of jungle. And that's why, like what had happened 30 years ago in Oslo Accords, all these components were not in Oslo Accords. And we said from day one, if there is no end for the criminal occupation, if there is no respect for international law, if there is no right for Palestinians of self-determination having their own state, if there is no accountability, we will end up with nothing. And this will be vicious circle and waste of time. It's just giving the criminals immunity and the occupation a free hand to be institutionalized. So again, this Trump plan, lack of basic fundamental elements of ending the occupation, self-determination, independence, accountability, respect of international law. That's why I think it's going to fail and going to explode. And while we are saying that, criticizing it politically and legally and humanly, is still the genocide and the ethnic cleansing going on non-stop. The third point, it's related to the two most important courts on earth, ICC and the ICJ. The ICJ decided in 3 provisional measures decision allowing humanitarian aid and allowing food flow to end the famine in Gaza and allow people to be treated humanly. Not a single state took that and implemented. I think the ultimate goal, provide Israel with full immunity. I think the ultimate goal, to make Gaza the graveyard of international law, international humanitarian law, and human rights. I think that would lead ultimately to the rule of jungle, not the rule of law, especially while we are witnessing and living this, and the whole world aware about what's going on against these two important courts. They don't support judges, they don't support prosecutors or the designated organizations, whether publicly or privately. Maybe they regret, they sorrow for that, but they didn't show any real stand in defending the creme de la creme of the human experience. And this moral, legal values, which is not a Palestinian invention, but it's the creme de la creme of the human experience. That's why, after all these practices and after all these decisions, we came to this Security Council decision, which for me, breaking my heart and mind when I'm see and witness in my life the Security Council, the most important organ on earth, violate international law, violate international humanitarian law, and basic fundamental human rights principles and rules for Palestinians. It's not bringing peace or security, it's just bringing the rule of jungle, unfortunately. The head of the Peace Council in Gaza involved directly in genocide. Under his leadership, he gave Israel full political support. Under his leadership, he defended them and failed the Security Council itself in at least 3 occasions from taking decision to have even ceasefire. He himself providing Israel with arms, ammunitions, aeroplanes, which caused the death and the destruction and helped in the genocide and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian people. He himself said, I'll take Gazan out from Gaza and make the Rivera. It's Kafka. And it's disrespect of intelligence of the people and values, having him as a president for this so-called Peace Council. no people in love and in need for justice, peace, and security more than the suppressed and the oppressed. We do want that, but not with any expense, not on the expense of justice, dignity, self-determination, and independence of the Palestinian people. They are going to do that to inflict more despair in our hearts and mind, to push us to lose hope in tomorrow and to give up. Never ever we will give up. Never ever we will lose hope in tomorrow. Never ever Palestinians will be good victims for a criminal belligerent occupation. And never ever Gaza will be the graveyard of international law. And we will keep the hope, strategic optimism, because we know we have just fair right cause, we are in the right side of history, and we will not allow this genocide and ethnic cleansing to continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raji, for your excellent analysis of the real situation on the ground in Gaza, the critical omissions from the Security Council resolution, and how the U.S. is undermining accountability for Israel's crimes with unprecedented sanctions against the ICC and leading Palestinian human rights organizations for using the law, for using international law. But thank you for giving us hope that the struggle continues. We support you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Bill Bowring. Bill?
Thank you, Marjorie. It's very hard to follow Raji Sarani. And, you know, as he was saying, this is heartbreaking and mind-breaking at the same time, what is presently happening. And I will come back to that. First of all, it's a great honor and privilege to be back here again at the People's Academy of International Law. So thank you very much to Marjorie and to the organizers. And just adding to what Marjorie said when she was introducing the speakers, I'm very glad to see comrades here from the Haldane Society of International Lawyers, Deepa Driver and others. I serve as International Secretary for quite a number of years, and our society has always been at the forefront of national liberation struggles and the struggle for international law and justice to the present day. So where I want to start is with self-determination. And I think it's really crucial to understand that the right of nations, the right of peoples to self-determination, that is not something new. Back in the 19th century, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels started using the concept of the right to self-determination in relation to Poland, first of all, which was had become part of the Russian Empire. And they fought from the middle of the 19th century onwards for Polish independence as a nation. But they were also ferocious critics of British and French imperialism in particular, giving full support to the uprising of the Indians against the British Empire, and to Algeria, which we'll be hearing from our other speaker, Miriam, in relation to France, and in particular, their wholehearted support for the Union side in the American Civil War. So on the handout, which has been posted, you will find what they had to say about the right to self-determination of nations and the fight for democracy. And in the 20th century, this was taken up by Vladimir Lenin. Lenin, by the way, has now become denounced by Putin. Why is he denounced by Putin? It's because of his firm commitment to the right of nations to self-determination, and in particular, the breakup of the Russian Empire, but also applied to all colonial empires. And for Putin, the great crime of Lenin was to establish in Putin's mind Ukraine as an artificial construction with the sole purpose of attacking Russia. So this is something Putin has repeated again and again, in particular in relation to his full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So the point which I want to make is that self-determination was not the invention of Woodrow Wilson, the American president, as we are sometimes led to believe. So far as Wilson was concerned, self-determination only applied in Central and Eastern Europe with the breakup of the Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires. It absolutely did not apply to the European and American colonial empires, and he made that absolutely clear. And the point I will return to is that my reading of Security Council Resolution 283 is that actually what it does is to create a new American colony. But I will come back to that. So very important to bear that in mind. United Nations, created after the Second World War, there is no mention in the United Nations Charter of the right of peoples to self-determination, nor does it appear, it's a principle, but not a right. And it does not appear in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that was an issue where the Soviet Union, which had which supported the anti-colonial struggles, but of course did not apply the principle to the USSR. But the Soviet Union abstained from the vote on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in part because there was no mention of the right of peoples to self-determination. So in the period following the Second World War and the creation of the United Nations, there were massive struggles for national liberation in the colonial empires. And of course, France suffered an enormous defeat in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam. And actually, the way that that battle was won against French imperialism was repeated years later in 1975 in the Battle of Saigon, when the United States suffered an enormous defeat. And during the period, right the way through after the Second World War, with the independence of India and Pakistan, with decolonization beginning in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa with Ghana, And the crucial year was 1960, and that was something Miriam will be talking about, I'm quite sure, later, which is the amazing film of Pontecorvo, The Battle of Algiers. And when I'm teaching self-determination, that is a film which my students are obliged to watch. And it brings out so many aspects of what the struggle for self-determination meant and means today. And 1960 was the year, very important for international law, of the declaration, the United Nations General Assembly Declaration on the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, Resolution 1514 of the 15th session. And that came about precisely because of the culmination of national liberation struggles in Algeria, but all over the world. And that resolution said that all peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. The voting on that resolution is extremely important. So it was adopted by 89 votes to 0, but 9 abstentions. And the abstentions were Australia, Belgium, Dominican Republic, France, Portugal, Spain, Union of South Africa, the United Kingdom, and the United States, so the colonial powers. And that, of course, was a General Assembly resolution, so not binding. And there wasn't a legal right as such until 1976, when the 2 international covenants on human rights, which Marjorie already mentioned in her introduction, came into force. They'd been open for signature in 1966, came into force in 1976. And the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is now 173 states parties. Even the United States ratified it in 1992 with many reservations. And the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, also 173 states parties. That's out of 193 states which are members of the United Nations. And those 2 covenants have common Article 1 in identical terms on the right of peoples to self-determination, not confined to colonial peoples or colonial struggles. And in 1970, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution on principles of international law, and that is taken as customary international law binding on all states. So here we have law, and we can look at a whole series of judgments of the International Court of Justice and advisory opinions. In respect of Palestine, in 2004, there was the advisory opinion on the legal consequences of the construction of the wall in occupied Palestinian territory, reaffirming the principle of self-determination and observing that the obligations violated by Israel included certain obligations erga omnes, meaning that they are obligations which every state is obliged to uphold. And very recently, there was a case against the country where I live in 2019, advisory opinion on the Chagos Islanders. The consequences have been not what one might have wanted to see. So here we have a right in international law. So how is that right to be achieved? And of course, the national liberation struggles, including in South Africa, many of those struggles were won. However, two peoples in particular, and the Palestinian people and the Kurdish people, and I took many cases at the European Court of Human Rights on behalf of Kurds, and many cases against Russia on behalf of Chechens, both peoples with the right to self-determination, which they have not been able to achieve. So that leads me directly to the second part of my presentation now, and that is the right of resistance. Now, the right of resistance, there's a splendid piece of work by somebody who's already lectured at the People's Academy, my colleague, Dr. Shahad Hamouri from Kent University in England. And she has published, and there's a reference in the handout, a paper, "The Palestinian people have the right of resistance by all means consistent with the principles of the UN Charter." This is not a right in the way that the right of peoples to self-determination is a legal right. But what we do find is that in a whole series of resolutions of the, thank you very much for putting that on the chat as well, a whole series of resolutions of the General Assembly confirm that the right of resistance is absolutely part and parcel. It is essential to achieving the right to self-determination. So what is the status of United Nations General Assembly resolutions? Well, on the one hand, they're not binding, but on the other hand, of course, the General Assembly is 193 states. It's the only place where every state in the world has a voice. And it's the way in which customary international law binding on all states can be achieved, even if it's not achieved straight away. And some of the most important resolutions were particularly in 1988 to do with the uprising intifada of the Palestinian people. And that was the first time that I went on mission for the IADL to the occupied Palestinian territories in 1988 at the time of the first intifada. And in 1989, there was a follow-up resolution, and it's been stressed over and over again during the 1970s in particular that armed acts of resistance are legitimate, that self-determination is to be implemented by all available means, including armed struggles. That was a resolution with respect to Zimbabwe, Namibia, Djibouti, the Comoros, and Palestine, of course. And in 1979, there was a resolution on the question of the South African occupation of Namibia, and the General Assembly supported the exercise of self-determination by the Namibian people by all means at their disposal, including armed struggle. Raji mentioned, of course, not only international law, but international humanitarian law or international law of armed conflict. And in the context of the national liberation struggles, the Geneva Conventions of 1949 were added to in the context of armed conflicts in which peoples are fighting against colonial domination and alien occupation and against racist regimes, etc. So there's a very strong case for saying, this particularly relates to Palestine, that there is a right of resistance to what is going on. And this has been repeated on many occasions, and it's all in the handout if you're interested. So where are we? This all sounds a bit desperate. So I think we go back to where this started in the 19th century. This is our slogan, and it's our banner, and it's something where we give absolutely full and unconditional support to people struggling for self-determination, particularly the Palestinians. And thank you very much, particularly the Palestinians. And I think we have to recognize that what is going on now is a continuation of what we've seen right the way through, which is extraordinary hypocrisy on the part of great powers. And just finishing with looking at our resolution, United Nations Security Council, not to repeat Raji, but what struck me is that this resolution says nothing about the West Bank, nothing at all. And Gaza is to be divided in two. It's already divided in two. So there's the eastern part of Gaza, which is now behind a wall of some description, where Israel is in full control and carrying out armed operations. That is where this Council of President Trump, in which a notable war criminal, Tony Blair, is to be involved, apparently. That is where they will have jurisdiction. And this somewhat mythical armed force, where is it going to be drawn from, one wonders? That's where they'll operate. Now, the western part of Gaza, what is to happen to the huge number of people there? And the question is that the humanitarian aid is not going in the quantities that it needs to. And there is nothing in this resolution about what happens to those people. And of course, what we're seeing in the West Bank now is a full process of annexation. And this is already the apartheid situation arising from 300 settlements, I think now, in the West Bank. The fact that the Palestinian Authority acts as agents for Israel and has done for many years and has no credibility. And so the two-state solution, in my opinion, is dead. How can there be a state in those circumstances? It will mean if there was to be anything resembling a state, that those settlements would have to be dealt with. And what we're seeing at the moment is absolutely unlimited, thank you, Deepa, absolutely unlimited support for the violence of the settlers. Every day, this becomes more horrifying. And of course, the parts of the West Bank, particularly Jenin, where there has been the greatest absolutely legitimate armed resistance to the illegal occupation, that is where we see an absolutely brutal depopulation of whole areas in order to enable the occupation to be. So this is the continuation of the Nakba. And I think there's no question but that in the minds of Netanyahu and the extremists in his cabinet, the policy is the elimination of the Palestinian population in Gaza and the West Bank. So it's an existential question. The one thing we cannot have any doubt about, though, is that the Palestinian people will continue to resist and continue to struggle, and that there has to be a final victory for them and for other people struggling for self-determination. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the rest of the speakers. I hope I haven't exceeded my time, Marjorie.
You have not, actually, Bill. Thank you so much for your analysis of the historical development of the right to self-determination, which I think many of us were unaware of, and also examples of General Assembly resolutions on the right of resistance, which, as you so eloquently stated, is part and parcel of the right to self-determination. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next, we have Max Bokwana. Max, the floor is yours.
Prof, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes.
Yes, we can.
No, first of all, I really would like to thank the Academy for the kind invite for me to share my own perspective on this important subject of international law at a time when the world seems to be in turmoil, where the rule of law seems to be an option and might has taken the place of being right. And at a time when the multilateral organizations are an irritation and a time of great uncertainty as to where will we be tomorrow. But as the organizers know, Prof, I suffer from the great deficiency that I'm not an academic, unlike my comrade Bill. However, I only agreed to this decision because as a disciplined member of the almost near extinct group of progressive lawyers, and when my president, Jean Myra, commanded me to do this assignment, I guess I had no choice but to oblige. But more importantly, I thought it's important that we make this intervention bill as we are doing, in particular when Raji is amongst us, because it is a period in the world where we decry the death of genuine international solidarity since the end of apartheid. So I think those of us that still remain in this journey must, without fear and hesitation, support the work of the IADL in defending, promoting, and advancing human rights throughout the world, and in particular for the people of Palestine, simple for their right to exist. On the other hand, the People's Academy, which I was part of its original conceptualization, is an important platform for those of us who are offended and pained by the callous disregard of human rights, disrespect for international law. Those of us that are offended by those who believe that somehow genocide can be justified in a world that is indifferent. I'm also glad, Prof, that IADL has, through this academy, established a well-deserved permanent tribute to Monique and Roland Vale. These are the people who inspired us to understand justice anywhere. To understand that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. They inspired us never to dishonor the cause of freedom and justice. They taught us, as the Cuban poet Jose Marti did, that man has no freedom to watch impassively the slavery and dishonor of fellow men, nor their struggles for freedom. I guess I'm amongst those that are privileged to have lived at a time that Monique and Roland lived. I recall, like Bill has done, one major assignment that we undertook as we traveled with Roland to Gaza in 2012. At that time, with Roland at the ripe age of 96, we were informed in advance of the dire situation in Gaza. The result was that fear had settled on some of our comrades, and others began to fake illnesses, and some blamed sudden deaths in their families. Roland was part of the last 50% that made it with us to Rafah border. As we approached the border and talking about the sudden withdrawal of many of our comrades, I remember him sarcastically asking, Are we a group of progressive lawyers organization or a nursing institute or just funeral undertakers? I remember, Prof, that at that time amongst us, we had a very dear comrade, Juan Mario Joseph, a truly revolutionary from Haiti, who in the face of him being declared stateless by his country for his efforts of being part of international solidarity, he never relented, because for him, solidarity was more important than even his personal liberties. Today, I suspect as we still face the unrelenting crisis in Palestine, we remember Roland, we remember Monique, we remember Mario Joseph. And finally, Prof, I accepted this engagement because the world faced unprecedented crisis, a weakened Europe, an aggressive Russia, a bullying United States, an economically growing China and India, but inwardly looking, having withdrawn from the struggles of the rest of the world. At the same time, the marginalization of the countries of the South, in particular our continent, Africa. So the United Nations, which was created to hold us all, today, as it has been demonstrated, it's on shaky grounds, as it faces being undermined by the most powerful nations. Institutions of economic development and justice are ignored at will. Truly, the center is not holding. But I do want to talk about a story of inspiration, that even if the long-suffering, struggling people around the world, they must understand that evil and injustice shall not prevail forever. It is in this context that I make this intervention on international law, the United Nations, and South Africa's quest for self-determination. More importantly, what lessons can be learned from this experience and what pitfalls should be avoided. Because almost 65 years ago, the United Nations General Assembly adopted that historic declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples, what was referred to as Resolution 1514, on the 14th of December 1960. Amongst other things, that declaration says, the subjection of peoples to alien subjugation, domination, and exploitation constituted denial of fundamental human rights, is contrary to the Charter of the United Nations, and is an impediment to the promotion of world peace and cooperation. It continues to say, all peoples have a right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. For the colonized, this declaration constituted an important step forward in terms of expanding the corpus of international law, to the extent that it declared that all peoples have right to self-determination. This proposition has been raised earlier in the context of the Second World War, when the United States President Theodore Roosevelt and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill adopted the Atlantic Charter in 1941, which served as a precursor to the United Nations Charter. In this context, they said they deem it right to make known certain common principles in the national policies in their respective countries, on which they base their hope, underline, for a better future for the world. Strangely, the October 1945 UN Charter suggested that colonial powers could continue to hold onto their colonies. This was contrary to Article 1 of the Charter, which spells out that one of the purposes of the UN is to develop friendly relations amongst nations based on respect for the principles of human rights and self-determination. In its Article 73, the UN Charter says members of the United Nations which have or assume responsibility for the administration of territories whose people have not yet attained full measure of self-government recognize the principle that the interest of the inhabitants of these territories are paramount and accepted as a sacred trust the obligation to promote to the utmost within systems of international peace and security established by the present charter the well-being of the inhabitants of these territories. And to this end, to agree to develop self-government, to take due account of political aspirations of peoples, to assist them in the progressive development of their free political institutions according to the particular circumstances of each territory and its people and the varying stages of advancement. To the extent that the UN Charter gave legitimacy to the continued colonial rule, of course with the proviso that the colonial powers will chaperone their words towards self-government. It is evident that this was done at the instance of the then colonial powers, principally the United Kingdom and France. On the other hand, the same declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples made the peremptory determination that all peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Inadequacy of political, economic, social, and educational preparedness should never serve as a pretext for delaying independence. So it goes without saying that the eradication of colonialism, apartheid, and white minority rule is one of the great and historic achievements of the period since the Second World War. So, colleagues, arguable South Africa is one of the greatest beneficiaries of this position taken by the United Nations, as reflected in some of the selected resolutions that I'm going to refer to. Its racial policies were on the agenda of the United Nations General Assembly from its very first session in 1946 until the inauguration of non-racial democratic government of South Africa in 1994. As an example, the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 1761 of November 1962, and this was a resolution a day before Mandela was sentenced to life together with his colleagues in the treason trial. That resolution called for severing of diplomatic ties with South Africa and closure of the ports. So that resolution was followed by a series of other resolutions prohibiting sale and supply of goods to South Africa, and also the resolution to support families of political prisoners, the resolution to support all those that were opposed to the policies of apartheid, particularly who are combating those policies in South Africa. Further resolution called on the suspension of educational, sporting, and other cultural exchanges with the racist regime in South Africa. it continues to include and add the resolutions that sought to declare South Africa as a pariah state. And in the end, by 1972, South Africa had been stripped all of its privileges in the memberships of the United Nations various bodies. Interestingly, this deprivation of privileges of rights for South Africa in the membership of the UN was opposed only by the United States and Israel. By 1973, the apartheid system of government then was declared a crime against humanity, which resolution came into effect on the 18th of July, 1976. Despite all of these things, South Africa still continues with its endeavor where it sought to define some of the majority of its population as people that have got no rights, no citizenship, and continues to entrench the white domination. And this, again, the United Nations condemned the creation of the Bantustans in South Africa, which were the entities that sought to denationalize Black South Africans. Just the second last resolution I need to refer to is Resolution 418, which was a unanimous resolution to outlaw cooperation with South Africa in the development and production of nuclear weapons. So what is clear here, colleagues, is that in the end, the United Nations and the international community stayed with South Africa's liberation movement in solidarity throughout the struggle against apartheid. It, in the end, helped with educating South Africa's future leaders, helped those of us that were in exile and that were refugees to be able to return, monitored elections, and support new policies for building a post-apartheid South Africa. It then helped us to be able to say we too, as South Africa, after a long, bloody and arduous struggle, we won the right to be free, to determine our own political status, and freely to pursue our economic, social, and cultural development. And this happened because the people that were part of the liberation movement were at the center of this struggle, but those that were coordinated by the United Nations and other bodies played the most critical secondary role to ensure that the white minority regime is finally defeated. But from the conversations we have had thus far, it's clear that what I have spoken about is also peppered with some of the greatest ironies of the modern time in undermining of the United Nations and international law, from being the protector of the weak, the vulnerable, and the oppressed, and also seek to prevent them from being part of the world that is peaceful and where their rights are guaranteed. Today, in a world that stands at a crossroad, where international law seems to be substituted by word and authority of the mighty, one such irony is that when the United Nations Declaration for Human Rights, one of the chief proponents was one fellow called Field Marshal Jan Smuts, who was then the Prime Minister of the Union of South Africa. When he spoke of human rights, quite clearly he regarded the majority of the inhabitants of his country as another class of humans. This was the time when the ill treatment of South Africa's Indian population was receiving international condemnation alongside the annexation of the then Southwest Africa, contrary to the positions of the United Nations as referred to by Bill. Worse still, this was also the time that brutality of apartheid intensified, characterized by wanton killings, forced removals, banning orders, exiling of many of the activists, and designing an education system whose pedagogical philosophy was to ensure that the black majority of South Africa are trained as hewers of wood and drawers of water in the service of superior white race that General Smuts represented. This is the cruel irony that characterized South Africa's encounter with the United Nations, with a leader speaking about human rights in the world stages and pursuing ethnic cleansing at home. The second irony, which I suspect is what we are about today, is that all of these important charters and declarations of the United Nations were a response to the never again commitment post-Second World War, following the international blight of genocide meted against Jewish people, and not forgetting the mass slaughter of more than 25 million Russian citizens during this Second World War. It is today's sad and twisted logic that as we speak, we are watching right in front of our eyes the destruction of a people whose only crime is being that they are not part of somehow a culturally and racially superior race, that their crime possible is only the fact that they are Palestinians. The same fate that befell the Jewish people about 8 decades ago, lest we forget. Like all of us, these Palestinians seek the right freely to determine their political status and freely to pursue their economic, social, and cultural development within the jurisdiction of their ancestral territory. That the Palestinians are facing the most brutal and inhumane treatment in the hands of Israel is the most irrational, unfathomable, and ironic act of memory lapse, if not cruelty. One important actor in this theater of foolishness is the United States. The United States, as a settler colonial state, had resolved its own Native American problem by way of ethnic cleansing at best, or genocide at worst. After many years, we would have thought that the US would have accepted accountability, learned the lessons on humanity, and single-mindedly moved towards the path of civilization as it enacted such progressive legislations as the Declaration of Independence, which included inalienable rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution abolishing slavery, and a long list of other groundbreaking legislative provisions and court judgments. In the end, correctly, the US earned itself a title of being the leader of the free world and an undisputed champion of liberal democracy. But America's consistent alignment with the oppressive regimes like the old apartheid South Africa and now apartheid Israel has betrayed this notion and placed it squarely against the ideals of liberty and self-determination. It is now back to the dark ages where there exists an inhumane belief that ethnic cleansing and genocide can be an instrument of solving political problems. Worse still, the belief that humanity must not extend to Palestinians, must not extend to the Sudanese, to the Syrians, to the Congolese, and that humanity in these places comes second to its commercial interest and commercial dealings. Similarly to the hypocrisy of Field Marshal Jan Smuts, the then Prime Minister of South Africa, whose people were the victims of the concentration camps and scorched earth policy of the cruel British Army, he was correct to participate in the drafting of the United Nations Declaration of Rights, but unfortunately his view of human rights was that these are the preserves of white tribes in Europe and in the colonies, and not of the indigenous inhabitants of these countries. As I conclude, the third settler colonial state, which is South Africa, saw it necessary that when South Africa attained its freedom, it needed to use its democratic status to redefine the end of conflict to mean peaceful coexistence, reconciliation, and genuine equality. To this end, for the resolution of international disputes, including the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, South Africa pledged its fidelity to the importance and respect for the international law, hence the approach to the International Court of Justice. This is radically different from the way in which both the US and Israel think these conflicts must be resolved. Sadly for them, this means undermining not only the rule of law, but multilateral institutions built to ensure a peaceful world. For this, South Africa as a country continues to pay dearly, but we have been here before and understood that forces of injustice and evil will never defeat a people in solidarity fighting for justice. Despite all of these challenges, we cannot afford to have gloom and doom to define our civic engagement as long as we remain and convinced that we are on the right side of history. Our generational mission is never to give in to the forces of darkness, but to march in solidarity with other progressive people of the world towards a civilized world that is peaceful and prosperous. I thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Max, for explaining the contradiction in the charter on the status of colonialized people, but also the Security Council resolution supporting the boycott of South Africa's policy of apartheid, and the declaration that apartheid is a crime against humanity. And I want to say that International Association of Democratic Lawyers was instrumental in getting that result and getting it declared a crime against humanity. Thanks also, Max, for pointing out the irony of the post-World War II system of accountability for the genocide against the Jewish people, and today's reality that the Palestinians' only crime is not being part of a, quote, superior race, unquote. So thank you so much for your compelling remarks. Much appreciated.
Thanks.
And now we have Miriam. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me well.
We can?
Good, great. So, good morning, afternoon, evening, depending where you are. I'll be discussing with you the connection between the Algerian Revolution, one of the most defining anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century, and the broader questions it raised in international law about the legitimacy of insurgency and the right of peoples to self-determination. This topic matters because the Algerian Revolution didn't just transform Algeria, it played a critical role in transforming international norms, shaping the legal and moral framework that governs the world and how we understand national liberation movements today. So in this presentation, I'll walk you through three main themes: the historical and political context of the Algerian Revolution, how insurgency and counterinsurgency played out and were perceived, and how this conflict pushed the international community, especially the United Nations, to define and expand the legal right to self-determination and the legitimacy of armed struggle in anti-colonial context. So to start, a bit of background on the history of colonial Algeria and the road to insurgency. Some of you may already know, but very few people actually know this, including in France, how Algeria was colonized in 1830, and that will help understand the legitimacy debates we need to understand the history of the colonial era of Algeria and how it set the stage for insurgency. So France invaded Algeria in 1830 after imposing a 3-year-long blockade on the country based on an alleged incident, which is most likely propaganda, known as the fly whisk incident. The then ruler of Algiers, which was under the governance of the Ottoman Empire at the time, the Dey of Algiers, would have hit the French ambassador with his fly whisk during a heated discussion, causing a diplomatic incident, according to France. So it's not quite a weapon of mass destruction, but it justified a 3-year blockade followed by a brutal invasion. But this invasion wasn't a simple occupation. It was a war of total subjugation. French troops used terror as a weapon. Villages were burned, crops were destroyed, civilians were massacred. One particularly shocking method was the enfumade, where Algerians hiding in caves were suffocated with smoke. Entire villages were killed in that way. During the siege of Larouat, a city in the South Saharan region of Algeria, in 1852, the French massacred the population after taking the city entirely. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a systematic strategy to crush any resistance. This was followed by settlement colonies. After conquering the territory, France encouraged European settlers, today known as the Pieds Noirs, to take over the best lands. This dispossessed the majority of native population, pushing them into poverty, sharecropping, or exile. Estimates today suggest that between 1830 and 1871, Algeria lost hundreds of thousands of people to warfare, famine, and disease, partly caused by these colonial policies, mostly caused by these colonial policies. In effect, the settlers' presence not only altered land ownership, but also created a deeply unequal society, laying the foundation for long-term resentment. French forces didn't just fight battles, they targeted civilians to prevent rebellion. An illustration of this is the well-known massacre of El Oufia in 1832, for example, where they killed around 100 civilians, but entire regions were subjected to scorched earth tactics, destroying villages, food supplies, and social networks. Leaders and social elites were targeted as well, leaving communities weakened and vulnerable. The French believed that terror and destruction were necessary to, quote unquote, pacify the territory, showing little distinction between fighters and ordinary civilians. So why this matters? This context helps understand why Algerians resisted. They were not simply rebelling, they were fighting for survival against a system designed to crush them politically, economically, and physically. This history of extreme violence, land theft, and repression set the stage for the FLN's struggle for independence, giving it a strong moral and political legitimacy. And it may sound familiar to you. In 1955, a famous former member of the French resistance, an ethnologist who had formerly resided in Algeria and studied its indigenous population, She was mandated, so her name is Germaine Tillon. I will share the reference to her works with you later, and I hope that it will be uploaded on the website. I really encourage everyone to read this. It's a striking, striking study of colonialism and its effects. So she was mandated by the then President Charles de Gaulle to return to Algeria and produce a report on the state of Algeria and its people. So she reconnected with those whose lives she had shared 20 years earlier, and she was appalled by the deterioration of their living conditions, which she described as vagrancy. And she explained it in the following terms. Vagrancy is the unprotected transition from the peasant condition, that is natural, to the urban condition, that is modern. I call protection a primary education that opens the way to a profession. In 1955 in Algeria, I dreamed of giving such protection to all children, both girls and boys. And she went on to try and open schools for the indigenous population in Algeria. But I wanted to note this quote because vagrancy is how she described the state of the Algerian population. In French, clochardisation, meaning that people were landless and reduced to a state close to that of vagabond. And this led, of course, to the Algerian Revolution, which we'll look at as an insurgency. To understand the dynamics of the Algerian revolution, it's crucial not only to look at the FLN military tactics, but also how the French responded. And the scale, the brutality, the institutionalization of counterinsurgency. The Algerian Revolution was not just a political movement, it was a full-scale insurgency that combined guerrilla warfare, political mobilization, and a struggle for international recognition. At the center of this struggle were the Front de Libération Nationale, also known as FLN, National Liberation Front, and its armed wing, the ALN, Armée de Libération Nationale, National Liberation Army, and they had a multifaceted strategy. In rural areas, the ALN carried out hit-and-run attacks on French military units, police posts, and their collaborators. They operated in the mountains, forests, remote villages, using knowledge of the terrain to their advantage, while in the cities, the FLN organized urban networks that carried out bombings, assassinations, and demonstrations. So you spoke about it earlier, Professor Baring, but I also encourage you to watch this movie if you haven't yet, The Battle of Algiers, which is not just really moving, but it's an incredibly realistic account of the beginning of this armed insurgency. And the counterinsurgency led by the French army. And it's perhaps the most famous example of this urban insurgency depicted in art. So the FLN's goal was to disrupt colonial administration, to gain popular support, of course, amongst the Algerian population, and to attract international attention to their struggle for independence. Their insurgency was carefully organized with cells operating semi-independently, which made it very difficult for the French forces to dismantle their networks completely. But the French response to this insurgency was extreme. France deployed hundreds of thousands of troops, including elite paratroopers and colonial units, and launched what was one of the most aggressive counterinsurgency campaigns in modern history. The French saw the insurgency not just as a military problem, but as a total challenge to colonial authority. And they adopted methods aimed at breaking both the insurgents and the civilian population's support for them. Central to this response was the use of torture and systematic repression. It was not a series of rogue incidents. It was part of a carefully designed counterinsurgency doctrine. French generals, including Jacques Massu and Raoul Salan, explicitly sanctioned extreme methods. Detainees were subjected to beatings, electric shocks, particularly in the genitalia, waterboarding, prolonged sleep deprivation, and sexual violence. Many were executed without trial, disappeared, or, the famous method, thrown from helicopters in what became known as the la méthode des paras, and was later exported in many other countries as a military doctrine. Entire neighborhoods were cordoned off, residents were interrogated, and the population was treated as potential enemy. This brutality extended beyond physical violence. The French military used psychological warfare as well, collective punishment, and forced relocation. Entire villages suspected of aiding the FLN were burned or destroyed, while civilians were sent to internment camps or controlled zones. This, I want to say, comes from the idea that the FLN was using the Maoist doctrine of war of insurgency, and that it dictated that the fighter for independence must feel like a fish in water amongst the local population. And the response of the French army to that was, well, let's empty the water so the fish may not feel as good anymore. And the water was, of course, the civilian population. So you had entire regions that were placed in camps and their homes destroyed, their crops completely destroyed and burnt, and they were placed in such situation for years. This brutality extended beyond physical violence. The French military used so we had psychological warfare, and we put entire populations in camps with the hope to quash the insurgency and terrorize the population. And they hoped to make it clear that support for the FLN would be met with such severe consequences that the population would withdraw its support. And they were part of a doctrine of counterinsurgency that, as I told you, would later influence military thinking worldwide. We have French officers who codified techniques of control of the population and how to eliminate insurgent networks. The systematic nature of these crimes meant that torture, repression became routine, not incidental. Documents from the French army show that this approach was fully institutionalized, creating a framework of counterinsurgency that prioritized short-term military win over ethical considerations. And I will also share later, apologies, I haven't had time to do it before, but the reference to an excellent French documentary which really traces the roots of this military doctrine of war, counterinsurgency wars, which is rooted, Professor Barring, you spoke about it earlier as well, in Indochina for France at the time, was then exported to Algeria, where it was transformed into a proper written doctrine, and after that exported mostly to military regimes in South America in order to fight insurgencies there. And again, I really encourage everyone to watch this documentary. It's really, really interesting and striking. So while these methods were effective in some respects, they disrupted the FLN networks, they captured some leaders. They came at a huge cost, of course, because widespread repression alienated the Algerian population. It intensified the resistance, and it drew international condemnation. Many French soldiers were also faced with severe moral and psychological challenges, witnessing or participating in atrocities against civilians. And this is something which you can read about in The Wretched of the Earth, which I think was posted on the website, a book by French Martiniquais Frantz Fanon, a French psychiatrist who worked in Blida in Algeria during the war, ended up supporting the FLN, and who wrote, for those of you who haven't read, also I encourage you to read The Wretched of the Earth, but also other books he wrote. Wretched of the Earth talks about colonization and its mechanisms in an absolutely amazing way. And he, in this book, describes also some of his work with the French troops that were made to perform torture and other atrocities on the Algerian population and its effects on these people. The French counterinsurgency in Algeria became a dark but influential chapter in military history. Its tactics, once classified, later became doctrines across the world. And the legacy of torture, repression, and civilian targeted is still recognized today. It was not incidental, but a systematic part of French strategy, aimed at maintaining colonial control at any human cost. In 2018, only 2018, the President of France, Macron, formally acknowledged the French state's responsibility for these crimes and acknowledged that torture was systematic indeed in Algeria. So in conclusion, the Algerian Revolution is an insurgency, shows us that it is, in fact, the absolute inevitable reality that stems from colonization. The FLN and the ILN fought not only against a military opponent, but against a system willing to use extreme organized violence against its own population. The revolution shaped as much by the insurgent strategies as by the French response, which itself became a model and a warning for how counterinsurgency can escalate into organized brutality. And understanding this dimension helps explain why Algerian resistance endured for nearly a decade, ultimately achieving independence in 1962. So why it matters for legitimacy and insurgency: the scale and the institutionalization of French repression underscore why the FLN and the ILN insurgency was not just a military rebellion, but a response to existential systemic violence. Political legitimacy: the French counterinsurgency doctrine itself revealed that the colonial regime saw Algerians broadly as an internal enemy, justifying extraordinary measures. That helps explain why the FLN's framing of its struggle in terms of national liberation resonated so deeply. And the methods used, later revealed and condemned, challenged traditional understanding of lawful war. They illustrate how counterinsurgency can degrade into systematic criminality when unchecked, and how historical insurgencies informed later debates on human rights, war crimes, and repression. So what was the state of international law before Algeria, and what was the status of self-determination at the time? So when the Algerian Revolution began in 1954, the principle of self-determination existed in international law, but only in a very limited, vague form. Colonized people, like the Algerians, had almost no legal recognition of protection under the rules of the time. In the time of the League of Nations after World War I, the League of Nations introduced the mandate system. Its language spoke of the interests of the people, but in practice, this meant that colonial powers administered the territories on behalf of the League rather than granting real autonomy. So there was no legal recognition that colonized people could demand full independence. Essentially, mandates were about managing territories, not liberating them. And this early framework set the tone for a world in which colonialism remained largely legal under international law. Finally, in 1945, the UN Charter adopted in 1945 introduced the phrase self-determination in Article 1, committing member states to respect the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. Yet this was vague. Colonial powers interpreted it to mean that self-determination applied only to already sovereign states or UN trust territories, not to colonies like Algeria. There was no formal legal mechanism for a national liberation movement to claim legitimacy. This left groups like the FLN in a legal gray zone, morally compelling, but technically criminal in the eyes of international law. At the outbreak of hostilities in November 1954, FLN combatants had no protection under international law. They were not recognized as lawful combatants or prisoners of war. If captured, they could, and often did, face execution, torture, or indefinite detention. This legal ambiguity reinforced the French argument that the conflict was a domestic rebellion rather than a legitimate struggle for independence. France, Britain, and other colonial empires relied on existing norms to justify their control, emphasizing sovereignty and territorial integrity. This perspective ignored the realities of oppression and systematic violence in colonies, showing that international law at the time protected colonial powers more than colonized people. It may still. For the FLN, this meant fighting a war that was morally justified in the eyes of many, but legally unprotected. International intervention or recognition was limited, and the insurgency had to rely heavily on political and diplomatic advocacy alongside armed struggle. And we moved on when the Algerian conflict helped expose the inadequacy of the legal framework. And by the late 1950s, debates at the UN began to challenge the idea that colonial rule was legally untouchable. The turning point, indeed, came in 1960 with the General Assembly resolution, which you mentioned earlier, Professor Bowring, number 1514, the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and People. This landmark declaration formally recognized that all peoples under colonial domination had the right to self-determination and independence. While Algeria did not immediately gain independence, these legal and normative shifts created international legitimacy for anti-colonial movements worldwide. So when the FLN launched its struggle, international law offered no protection. Yet the Algerian Revolution, alongside with other anti-colonial movements, directly influenced the evolution of international norms, highlighting a gap between law and morality. By the 1960s, self-determination became a recognized right, showing how insurgencies can reshape international law and challenge the legitimacy of entrenched colonial systems. Understanding this legal backdrop is crucial. It explains why the FLN needed not only military and political strategy, but also international advocacy to frame their struggle as legitimate, and why the post-war evolution of international law increasingly sided with anti-colonial movements. So, how the Algerian Revolution shifted international law. The FLN quickly understood that fighting alone with weapons would not secure independence. Military action had to be paired with political and diplomatic legitimacy. They launched a sophisticated diplomatic campaign, sending delegations abroad, building alliances with newly independent states in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and lobbying international organizations. Their aim was to bring the Algerian struggle to the international stage, particularly the United Nations. By doing so, the FLN positioned itself not simply as a group of insurgents, but as a representative of colonized people demanding liberation. And as Benjamin Stora, a historian who also wrote profusely on the history of Algeria, its colonization, and its revolution, this diplomacy, he wrote that this diplomacy transformed the war from a colonial rebellion into a matter of international concern. Through these efforts, the FLN could frame its struggle in terms of universal principles of justice and self-determination, which resonated with many newly independent states. So beginning in 1955, the UNGA repeatedly debated the question of Algeria, as it called it. France consistently argued that Algeria was an internal matter since it was legally part of French territory. However, the international context was shifting. and it challenged this view, arguing that colonial oppression was a global problem, not a domestic one. These states supported the FLN diplomatically, demanding that the UN address the situation as a legitimate matter of international concern. And these debates began to blur the line between rebellion and legitimate liberation. Insurgencies against colonial powers could no longer be dismissed as mere criminal uprisings or domestic disturbances. The Algerian example demonstrated that armed struggle, when tied to a claim of national self-determination, could gain political and moral recognition internationally. Resolution 1514 of 1960 by the UN General Assembly, which I already mentioned, on the declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and people. It marked a historic shift in international law and recognized key principles. All peoples have the right to self-determination. Colonialism must be brought to a speedy and unconditional end. Armed struggle may be justified when peaceful avenues for independence are blocked. So it is a UNGA resolution, so not legally binding. The resolution has enormous normative weight, however, I would argue, and it signaled that the international community now supported the legitimacy of anti-colonial movements. The Algerian Revolution played a central role in shaping this resolution, showing the limits of colonial powers and the legitimacy of national liberation struggles. Broader legal normative consequences, Algeria's struggle established a framework for national liberation movements. Resistance against colonial or racist regimes could now claim both legal and moral legitimacy. And the principles of Resolution 1514 later influenced international humanitarian law, including the Additional Protocol 1 to Geneva Convention of 1977, which explicitly recognized the combatant status of organized resistance movements in wars against colonial domination or foreign occupation. And of course, beyond the treaties, the Algerian example shaped customary international law, showing that state recognition and international support can confer legitimacy on struggles previously dismissed as rebellion. Algeria's experience provided a blueprint for other anti-colonial movements from Mozambique to East Timor, demonstrating that armed struggle in pursuit of self-determination could be morally and politically validated on the global stage. So this matters because the Algerian Revolution shows that law and politics evolve together. Military success, local legitimacy, and international diplomacy combined to reshape the rules of the international system. The war revealed that international law is not static. It responds to new realities, especially when oppression is systematic and peaceful avenues for change are blocked. Algeria set a lasting precedent. Armed resistance against colonial domination could no longer automatically be criminalized, but could be recognized as a legitimate expression of a people's right to self-determination. In short, it helped transform the moral and legal framework of international law, making it possible for future generations to argue for liberation and justice under global norms. So insurgency and legitimacy in international law, the criteria for legitimate insurgency by 1960s and 70s, the international community began wrestling with a crucial question. Where, if ever, can armed insurgency be considered legitimate under international law? Scholars, diplomats, and legal experts gradually formulated a set of criteria. Representation of a colonized or oppressed people. The insurgent movement must act on behalf of a population whose political rights are denied or whose sovereignty is suppressed. The FLN clearly fit this criterion, as it claimed to represent the Algerian majority under the French colonial rule. The exhaustion of political and legal avenues. Legitimate insurgency presupposes that peaceful or institutional channels for change have been blocked. In Algeria, repeated attempts at negotiation or reform were rejected by French authorities, leaving armed struggle as the only feasible avenue. The aim of achieving self-determination, the ultimate goal must be national liberation of fundamental politics rights, not personal gain or sectarian conquest. Again, the FLN fits this definition. Compliance, at least in part, with humanitarian principles. While insurgencies are inevitably violent, legitimacy increases if movements avoid indiscriminate attacks on civilians and adhere, at least in principle, to norms of proportionality and necessity. And I want to emphasize here the fact that there's a balance to be struck here, of course, and that sometimes violence is acknowledged and recognized as inevitable. Over time, the FLN came to be widely recognized as meeting these conditions, and both politically and increasingly in emerging legal framework. And then the codification of Geneva Additional Protocol 1 in 1977 was also directly influenced by the Algerian struggle. And it recognized the national liberation wars, the state of combatant and prisoner of war, the status of combatant and prisoner of war for the fighters in such struggles. And this is a landmark acknowledgement for anti-colonial insurgencies. The legacy of Algeria is there in the codification of Protocol 1 and the principles that emerged since the 1950s. Insurgencies against colonial powers, when meeting certain conditions, are distinct from terrorism or criminal rebellion. Algeria was one of the key cases that shaped this recognition, influencing debates at the UN and among state parties to the Geneva Convention. We still have ongoing ambiguities and debates, of course. It did not resolve all the questions, the codification. International law recognizes legitimacy only under specific conditions. An important debate remains. Of course, where is the line between terrorism and legitimate resistance? And who can claim to represent a people? And when is violence a last resort? Of course, these debates are far from settled. Modern conflicts continue to echo these questions, which were not, of course, crystallized by the Algerian Revolution. I want to touch on the impact internally also, because we speak of right to self-determination, but I also wanted to shed a light on how internally in France, the struggle for the Algerian Revolution has shaped the legal landscape of France and continues to shape it in the current criminalization and oppression of notably people who advocate for Palestine. So the Algerian war was not only fought on Algerian soil, its methods and legal logic spilled over into metropolitan France. In Algeria, French forces developed a brutal counterinsurgency doctrine to suppress the FLN and the ALN. Torture, forced disappearances, summary execution, helicopter drops were systematically employed. But this was not rogue violence, it became institutionalized, and it created a framework of repression that blurred the lines between military and civilian targets. And they became codified in law and extended to French territory. Paris and other urban centers saw Algerian workers and students treated as potential insurgents. Laws gave police extraordinary powers. Curfews, mass arrests, arbitrary detention were common. The most infamous example was in 1961, the Paris massacre, when a peaceful demonstration against conscription in Algeria was violently suppressed. So the conscription was in Algeria, but the protest was in Paris. The police beat demonstrators and threw many of them in the Seine River, resulting in dozens of deaths, many still unaccounted for today. This merging of military doctrine and legal authority shows how colonial counterinsurgency strategies became a domestic tool. Techniques first developed to quash rebellion abroad, applied on French soil, exposing how the logic of war and occupation could permeate the metropole. It also demonstrates the continuity of repression. The same legal and security frameworks that allowed mass violence in Algeria were used to control and intimidate Algerians living in France. And present-day policing and social unrest in France is still marked by the Algerian Revolution. It left a deep imprint on the French national order. The counterinsurgency methods honed during the war, torture, arbitrary detention, established a precedent for how state would respond to perceived internal threats. These tools were not confined to Algeria, but also came into the metropole. And today, for instance, we celebrated this month the 10th anniversary of a very sad incident when two kids who were running away from police went into hiding inside of a electric transformer installation, and this led to a tragic accident, causing their death. As a result of this, we saw 10 years ago a uprising in Paris and then in all of France, in the suburbs, widespread protests highlighting the long-standing known grievances over police practices, social exclusion, and inequality. And the French government, at the time, the president Nicolas Sarkozy, responded with a heavy-handed approach and used a state of emergency law that was originally enacted during the Algerian War. It was a law designed to give the state extraordinary powers to suppress rebellion, and it allowed police raids, curfews, mass arrests, which were once again carried out to restore order and quash the protests. So this episode illustrates the striking continuity. The laws and methods developed during the colonial and counterinsurgency era were repurposed decades later to control domestic unrest. It shows how the legacy of the Algerian conflict, both legal and tactical, continued to shape the French state response to perceived internal threats. And this is just an example, but the list could go on, and the use of such techniques and methods is endless and continues, and is used to now target militants of the Palestinian cause. I have in mind the example of a European member of parliament elected by the French, Rima Hassan, who is a dual citizen Palestinian and is regularly targeted by police, was brought in for interrogation on suspicion for complicity to terrorism because she's just simply being vocal about the crimes committed in Palestine at the moment. So the Algerian Revolution didn't just change Algeria, it reshaped the world. Its influence rippled across continents, inspiring liberation movements everywhere, from Vietnam to Angola, Mozambique, South Africa, Palestine. Leaders of these struggles looked to Algeria as both a model and a symbol. And it became a central voice. Algeria became a central voice for the movement of the non-aligned, leveraging its newfound diplomatic weight to champion anti-colonial causes on a global stage through the United Nations and other international forums. Algerian diplomats pressed the case that self-determination was not just a moral principle, but a legal and political right, echoing the very struggles that had defined their own revolution. Meanwhile, in France, the shadow of the Algerian War has lingered for decades. The war's brutality, particularly the widespread use of torture, forced disappearances, systematic repression, forced the French state to confront difficult questions about colonialism. It still does. I would say that it's widely unfinished, this work. National identity and the moral costs of the empire are also debates that still need to be had in France. Public debates, historical research, and official apologies are part of this process, but again, I would say that very little has been achieved yet. So we're still dealing with the legacy of the Algerian Revolution domestically and internationally, but it's hopefully compelling and will continue to compel France to wrestle with its past, shaping ongoing conversations about history, memory, and accountability. Sadly, I would say that we probably haven't done enough in the way of this, considering the current position of France with regards to Palestine. And let's hope that we can continue to have this conversation. The legacy of the Algerian Revolution is twofold, I would say. It empowered oppressed people to claim their right for self-determination, and it reminded states and the international community that the pursuit of security cannot override the fundamental principles of law, morality, and human dignity. It forces us to confront the central truth about legitimacy, sovereignty, and the right to resist. International law did not grant the Algerian people their freedom, they seized it. And in doing so, they helped reshape the very norm that govern our understanding of self-determination and insurgency today. And as we have seen, the legacies of that struggle, its doctrines, its legal aftershocks, and its unresolved wounds continue to shape state power, policing, and political dissent in France and beyond. And to finish, I will leave you with a quote from Frantz Fanon I spoke about earlier, who I think captured the enduring reality with unmatched clarity when he of the decolonial struggle, when he wrote, "When we revolt, it's not a particular culture. It's not for a particular culture. We revolt simply because, for many reasons, we can no longer breathe." And I think you'll share with me the thought that tonight, on the wake of this disgrace of a UN Security Council resolution, I, as many of you, cannot breathe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miriam, for detailing the history of French colonialism in Algeria and France's policy of counterinsurgency, oppression, and torture of the Algerian people that led inevitably to their revolution. Thank you also for explaining how the case of Algeria informed the international legitimacy of national liberation struggles. Thank you, Algeria. And also, thanks for highlighting the Battle of Algiers, one of my favorite films, and The Wretched of the Earth, one of my favorite books. I just pulled it off the bookshelf. Here it is, folks, with a preface by Jean-Paul Sartre. Mandatory reading for everyone. So thank you. Thank you again. Okay, well, this has been a wonderful presentations, and I've seen lots of feedback agreeing with that sentiment. What I would like to do now is to move to a period of interaction between the faculty members, commenting on each other's remarks, making additional remarks, questions, etc. So I'm now going to open it up to the faculty to speak amongst yourselves, talk amongst yourselves, and then we'll go to the questions from our students.
A quick question, Marjorie, to Mariam, and really thanks, Mariam, for taking us through this this journey, and it really raises something with me that thinking about Algeria still today continues to talk about revolution, which I think is critical because liberation movements must not die because what you call a date of independence means a date of a possibility to be free. This continent is very far from being free. Now, with the deaths of the liberation movements in the continent, and obviously replacement with neocolonialism, what do you think should still be the role of the FLN and in galvanizing as it did before the liberation movements in our continent?
Thank you, Max. So when you talk about the FLN today in Algeria, it's, I'm afraid, become a slightly different thing from what it was in the 60s. And of course, you will know that there has been recent movements in the wake of the so-called Arab Spring in favor of democratization and more freedom in Algeria in the form of the Hirak, which is the name of the movement, which defines itself as, in fact, very anti-FLN. Nowadays, FLN in Algeria is somewhat perceived as a part of a neo-colonial entity that has control over the country. But I mean, it's important to understand that the FLN it's not, and it's never been, as is the case for these movements often, it's not a single unified entity. It's part of it's got many parts, and everybody in Algeria had dealings with the FLN. My family was involved with the FLN. So today, what should be their role? I mean, the question is more, what is the role of the people when we talk about revolution and liberation, and how can we revive those movements on the continent? I think that is very dear to me and important and close to my heart is the notion of popular movement. And when we discuss the revolution and its past, I was saying in my presentation that very little has been done in the way of documenting it, memorializing it. Of course, there is symbols and anniversaries that are celebrated. There's the Monument of the Martyrs in Algiers. There's a museum. But when it comes to repossessing the people of their own history. I will tell you this simple story. I grew up going to Algeria as a child, unfortunately not going there in the 90s because of the civil war, but I grew up going to my family's farm, and there was a plane there, which was a plane by the French army that had been shot by my family, who was then displaced and put in camps. And the farm was completely destroyed. And it took me probably more than 20 years to actually understand and realize what had truly happened there. Out of a matter of, I would say, probably dignity and sadness. And people don't talk about what happened during the war. And my grandparents never really told me that they were put in camps. My father never told me that our farm was entirely destroyed. And, these things are things that we need to own as a people. It doesn't belong to the FLN or whoever is in power now or the historians. And so I would argue that it starts with popular archiving, knowing our history, amending our history books, and that also holds true for France. And from knowing the history of these struggles and the role of the people in them, that is how I think we can re-empower the people and not necessarily groups or movements to achieve and continue the revolutions that were started in the 50s and 60s and that are still ongoing, and to support the struggles, of course, of our brothers and sisters in Palestine and elsewhere.
Thanks.
Any other comments from the faculty? Okay, well, we can move into the questions. There have been a number of them, a lot of interest in this program. First of all, what can we do to prevent the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2803 and prevent the U.S. and Israel from taking absolute control of the Palestinian territories and the resources, including the offshore resources? Actually, maybe what I'll do is read a few questions and then people can respond, and it may be that there is some overlap. Why did Pakistan and Algeria vote for the Security Council resolution? Does the UN need to be replaced with an alternative international law system based in the global south? Is the Uniting for Peace resolution still possible in the General Assembly given this Security Council resolution? What do you think of the transfer of Palestinians to South Africa, is that supported by international law? What are the tasks ahead for progressive lawyers? And the ICJ said Israel had to withdraw from all occupied territories and dismantle the settlements by September. It was criminal to allow the stealing of Palestine from the Palestinian people, the indigenous people. How do we accomplish that when even the ICJ only deals with half of the problem? So let's start with those and see if there are any comments from any members of the faculty about any of those questions.
These are a lot of questions. May I?
Yes, Raji.
I agree.
Yes.
It's a lot of questions and all of them important, I think. But basically, what I want to say that this is unique and unprecedented situation, like everything, I mean, related to Palestine. I mean, you have the pyramid on its top, not on the base. It's extremely exceptional. I mean, with that, how can irrelevant of the countries voted and why they voted? Unfortunately, I mean, even Palestinian Authority wasn't vocal, strong in opposing that. I don't know why and for what reasons. Maybe reasons we don't know, but I'm sure among other things they have been threatened or intimidated, and even with that, they have no excuse. At least, I mean, you can do that outside the Security Council if you are really, I mean, opposing. But if you claim that you are representing the Palestinian people, you should defend till the last breath. I mean, their interest, their unalienable rights. If you are the representative of the Palestinian people, you can not compromise any of these rights. The Security Council resolution, ugly, bad. It's against the ABCs of international law. It's against the ABC of all resolutions has been taken to the interest and rights of the Palestinian people since this conflict began. How we can pass something illegal doesn't fit, I mean, with international law. This can be challenged by United for Peace and Security, I mean, in the General Assembly. Who will move that? Who will move? I mean, this Palestinian Authority, Palestinian State, or the Arab League, or the representative of the Arab Islamic bloc? I have no clue about that. That's why, practically speaking, it's very unlikely, I mean, to challenge that now there. That's why this need, I mean, to be thought of. And this is major responsibility, not, I mean, for the states, which obvious their hands or necks has been twisted by the mighty US. Now, what we can do? I mean, I'm just shedding light on Oslo Accords again. When Oslo Accord was signed, and there was this big part at the South Lounge of the White House, and all or most of the world leaders, I mean, were there. We were very critical, and we criticized that rightly and legally. And we said this never ever can be peace or bring peace for simple reason. No word about end of the occupation. There is no word about self-determination, the unalienable rights of the Palestinian people, the right of refugees, I mean, to come back, among other things. And there is no word about the Palestinian state, simply clear and candid. Here you don't even have a word about West Bank, as rightly has been said by Bill, and all the ABCs we are talking about, international law, international humanitarian law, human rights, no word about accountability. So we have to think. I mean, can this survive? Is this is going to work? How can we accept genocide, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, war crimes, crimes against humanity, persecution happening now? Now I'm talking about now, and this ceasefire doesn't end it. And we will talk about peace. Then I remember many Western leaders were telling us, we fully understand and appreciate your criticism for Oslo Accords and be lack of all that. But we have to compromise rule of law, democracy, human rights, international law for security and peace, as if security and peace contradict international law and the human rights. I think and believe if we want real peace and security, they should come all the way along with the rule of law, with international law, with accountability. Once again, accountability. We were talking in the beginning about the 80th anniversary of Nuremberg trials. Tomorrow, it will coincide that. And Israel, like a small goddess, I mean, they did all what they are doing because they know and they feel the leadership and the people, the army and civil society, nobody will hold them accountable. And that's why you don't have one criticism, I mean, for that. Now, having said that, I think we have to speak truth to power and criticize that and speak publicly about it. We will contribute with our share as Palestinian people. We paid extremely heavy, bloody bill, especially in the last 2 years. But we are not giving up. And I don't think any will give up. And we will continue, I mean, with our struggle. That's our fate, our destiny. We are the stones of the valley. We have been there since ever. We will continue there forever. And no power on earth will uproot us from there. They tried. and they failed. And I hope they fail in the future. But it has been proven also that a solidarity movement across the globe gave the fourth dimension in this. And the international solidarity movement have unique and very special mixture between politics and international law. Even if you see their activities, their slogans, it fits ideally, I mean, with that. That's why I think the international solidarity movement should have responsibility. Once again, it's not the battle of Gazan or Gazans. It's not the battle of Palestinians. It is every free person, mission or mission, to speak truth to power, to defend international law, including the Palestinian right of justice and dignity and self-determination. So we have to join forces to keep the struggle, to keep the fight, to keep the spirit, not to be deceived by saying peace is there, ceasefire is there, it's the end of the story. No. Strongly reminding genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing till this moment is continuing. Our problem, it's not some bags of wheat or some food to be sent to Gaza. We have first-class political problem. Our case is not humanitarian, it's political, supported by international law, and that should be, I mean, respected and supported.
Thank you, Raji. There is this, of course, inherent contradiction in the UN Charter, which puts the power for deciding how to maintain international peace and security in the hands of the Security Council. What happens when the Security Council violates the Charter? Who has the final word? And clearly, the Security Council is violating the UN Charter with this resolution. And that's where your comments are so critical, Raji, about the international solidarity movement. And I want to highlight the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which we haven't mentioned yet, BDS, which is really a very, very significant force, so much so that countries, including the United States, the federal government, and many of the states are passing anti-boycott laws in violation of the U.S. Constitution's First Amendment freedom of speech. And boycotts, the right to boycott goes way, way back in U.S. history. And what has happened since, as Raji calls it, the live streaming of genocide for now more than 2 years, is that the BDS movement has become mainstream. And whereas before it was marginal, there were, there was some divestment and boycott going on, but now it has become mainstream, and I think it's very, very significant and it should be supported. And then, of course, we have the mobilization of shame, which is what has been mobilized against Israel in the eyes of the world as people watch this mainstreaming of genocide. The PBS NewsHour, which is not a particularly radical station, every single night they have images of the Palestinian people, of the rubble. They have interviews with people in Gaza who are suffering, and this is only going to continue. Yes, Max.
No, I was saying, Marjorie, I really agree with you entirely, similar to the point that Miriam made, that we're facing a reality of the delegitimization of the United Nations, in particular the Security Council. And when we face a situation like that, I mean, I recall many of us wanted to commit collective suicide when Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan became the leaders of the United Kingdom and the United States at the same time, completely opposed to our liberation. But it was the people of the United States and the people of the United Kingdom that proved that they are actually sovereign. I think even today, in an environment when the smaller clique takes a particular decision against the realities of what we see in Palestine, it has to be the people that reclaim their sovereignty and denounce the behavior of these countries. So in the end, that issue around BDS, whether it's cultural, whether it's sporting organizations, whether it's the workers refusing to offload the ships, etc., etc. I think the people's power needs to be put back at the center.
A couple of the questions have mentioned the Uniting for Peace resolution in the General Assembly, and the question is, what country will introduce it? Before George W. Bush invaded Iraq in his illegal 2003 Operation Iraqi Freedom, there was a move to introduce a Uniting for Peace resolution, and the U.S. government, this was under the Bush administration, basically pressured and blackmailed many of the countries into not doing that, not introducing that resolution in the General Assembly. Now, President Petro from Colombia has said that he would do it, and I think he said that before the Security Council resolution. I don't know what the status is now, and there was a question about what is the legal force of the Uniting for Peace resolution when the Security Council has already acted. They've already passed this resolution, because the Uniting for Peace resolution says that when the Security Council is unable to act or unwilling to act, then the General Assembly can actually recommend even the use of force measures, forceful and non-forceful measures to restore international peace and security. So, and I don't know that there has actually been a test of that, the introduction of a Uniting for Peace resolution after the Security Council has seized itself of the matter. Just wanted to throw those ideas out.
Marjorie, if you allow me, my son, he graduated from SOAS, and he took his master's in law, and he decided to come down to Gaza and to contribute his share as a Palestinian. He's very open-minded, and he took all his education outside. And he witnessed a lot of horrors in Gaza, and he was genuinely committed for human rights and rule of law. And he stayed 2 months during the war till we were bombed together in my house with 1,250 kilos rocket. And we stayed after that 1 month almost. And he was saying to me that the world knows about that or not. I'm definite the world knows what's going on here. Is this the graveyard of international law? Is what's happening the graveyard of international? This in 2023, early December. Now we are still, not remembering the ABCs. US and Europe leadership went to Israel and they said, Israel do have the right of self-defense. Shame on them. They are stupid, ignorant. They don't have advisors. They don't have legal advisors. They have no clue about international law, international humanitarian law. They know it all. Since when? Criminal belligerent occupation in the most well-documented conflict in history can have the right of self-defense. Shame on them. This is the colonial racist mentality. This is not the law. It's simple and clear. You don't need first-class academics like you and Bill Bowering to discuss that. You can bring kindergarten student in international law and he will tell them that. This is the racist colonial mentality and politics. It's not matter of using law. I am a jurist. I spent the last 45 years in my life one-way ticket doing law for Palestine. They accused us of being ignorant. We don't know. We don't understand. This is Israel. This is the oasis of democracy in the Middle East. Use law. Use international law. We use them all. And we proved effectively we have moral, legal, human superiority on them. In the courtyard, in the ICJ, in universal jurisdiction cases where coward Europe, it changed the entire law to provide more protection for Israel. The issue, it's not the law. It's not the law. It's the racist colonial West. Till today, Europe discussing whether it's should activate Article 2 of the association agreement or not. Whether Israel deserves to be in the revision or not. All what they dare do with the most well-documented conflict in history and has consensus among Palestinian, Israeli, International League and Human Rights Organization to say to the European citizen, these are products of settlements and you have the right to buy it or not. Shame on them. So going, to Security Council or going to General Assembly, is it really, worth that? And if you have 10 more resolutions, is that going to make any difference? There is deep sense of justice and total destruction of international law. Why this didn't happen in Ukraine? Why the selectivity, politicization, double standard applied there? Why Ukraine from day one? Invasion, occupation, they have the right to resist it with all ways, with all means, including armed struggle. And they called the free Europeans and Americans to go join their brothers in Ukraine with arms and to struggle with them. and the NATO pledged and committed themselves to invest their best in supporting them economically, militarily, politically, and legally. And they resorted to ICJ. And they remembered our rhetoric, which we are using for years. We thought the world opened up their eyes. Europe realized finally what's the importance of international law. But all this in vain. You have just September, 159 states voted for the Palestinian state. You have last year decision taken by the ICJ, the advisory opinion about the illegality of the occupation. It should end in 1 year. In this September, who's talking about that? What the state did? Now, this is the point. I mean, resort to this, BDS fine, this fine. No. I mean, we have a problem. We are once again to the rule of jungle. And this Trump, he just getting us and the whole world to the hell. That's what we don't see. I think this is not Palestine. This is not just genocidal war. This is not only one more Security Council resolution, it's beyond. The international system doesn't work. International law doesn't work. Should we give up? Or stand for the challenge? That's why it's not per se Palestinian issue. We have it on our skin. We pay daily for it. Maybe we succeed or not. But I can assure you, we will act as ever, as romantic revolutionaries who believe in justice, rule of law, dignity of man, and never ever we will be good victims for genociders, racists, and their partners. We will contribute with our share, but I think this is the responsibility of the people of the globe to stand against that as well.
Well, with that, Raji, those remarks, they're so powerful and they're so true and they're so right on. And when you say international solidarity movement, we all really need to take to heart, what can we do? And to stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people and continue the struggle. Thank you.
I met with the young Greta this morning. I have lunch with her. Greta of Sweden. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
She symbolized the young generation of solidarity movement across the globe. She is wonderful, fantastic, full of energy. And I asked her genuinely, what do you think, Greta, about this Security Council? She said, Raji, the genocide, the apartheid, and the ethnic cleansing continue. Till Palestine is free, we will never stop. This is what Solidarity Movement should do. With this spirit, this gives us very strategic optimism and very powerful message. We are not alone. And I hope we are not alone. Together with the free, committed people across the globe, one day we shall overcome and we will have dignity and justice.
Amen, Raji. Thank you so much for joining this panel. Thank you to our esteemed faculty.
Marjorie, I just wanted to, I'm going to send you a list of books. No, these are the books on international solidarity. We have written 5 volumes on the road to democracy on international solidarity. I will send you this because in the end, what Raji is saying, the struggle for Palestine is a struggle for all humanity. It's no longer going to be just various nations together. It's our humanity that we are fighting for.
The Madiba said it long time ago, Maxwell.
Thank you, Max. And we will also post a link to those books on the website, along with the presentations from this program. We're going to have to let our interpreters go now. This has been an absolutely terrific program, one of our very best in the 2 years that the Academy has been in existence. I thank you all so much, Miriam, Bill, Max, and Raji, for your incredible presentations. Thank you to the People's Academy Task Force, our administrator, our interpreters. The next program of the People's Academy of International Law will be Course 11, International Lawyers Take on the Crisis in the World Capitalist System. Stay tuned. It's scheduled for December 16th, and faculty members will include Bernard Bokojin from Togo, Walden Bello from the Philippines, among others. So we will be sending you a notice for that December course, and dare to struggle, dare to win. Thank you so much. Power to the people.
Thanks.
Thanks a million. Bye.